Chapter 9, The New American. On the happy close of the conference in Virginia in 1780 dawned not only a new era for Methodism in America, but a new civic experience came to its leader. From that hour, Asbury began to be an American, having been made a full citizen in Delaware. Some days before, he was now free to go as he chose. The invitation of the Virginians to ride through their territory was therefore accepted, and the task entered upon without delay. The gloomiest days of the war were at hand. Cornwallis had overrun South Carolina and was pressing northward to a strong position in Camden, where he later inflicted a crushing defeat on the Americans under General Gates. A division of the Continental Army was now moving southward, and Asbury was sometimes in its wake, sometimes on its flank, as he stopped to preach and then rode a forced stage to meet another waiting company. There was daily expectation of hostilities at the front, but in the face of these threatening conditions, the tireless itinerant pressed on through southern Virginia and upper North Carolina, the stages of his journey aggregating more than 1,000 miles, marked by literally hundreds of sermons and exhortations. Asbury was now bishop de facto. The whole work had been put under his care by competent canonical action. He had been given by the North Conference primacy in all matters of administration, and the same power over legislation as that enjoyed by Mr. Wesley in England, and this had been practically agreed to by the preachers in the South. But for all this, there was much to do to perfectly heal the breach made by the sacramental controversy. There were members of the party of separation yet to be met and reconciled. A questioning spirit amongst the people had also to be answered. This was one of the chief ends to be served by the tour. Therefore, as he had advanced, he not only called sinners to repentance, but gently urged the saints to be of one mind. Methodists he exhorted to follow him, as he followed Wesley. Relief was sure to come at no distant day, and they must be patient. This work of reconciliation was not easy. The established church had collapsed, and, except in a few cases, its priests had either fled or had been expelled from the country. The people were receiving with gladness the old new truths of the gospel as preached by the Methodists, and they demanded that these truths should be confirmed in the sacraments. With monarchy, they had given up sacerdotalism and could not understand why the administration had been suspended. But such was his power over men of all stations, that wherever Asbury went, these doubts were composed, though elsewhere much unrest continued to prevail. He had, however, set himself to silence the controversy, and could neither withhold his voice nor rest his goings until he saw the end. In Virginia, he had the joy to meet again the Reverend Mr. Jarrett, who was one of the few priests of the establishment remaining in the country. Being a native of Virginia, and in the full sympathy from the first with the efforts of the colonies to gain their independence, he was naturally a man much respected, while his evangelical spirit and his zeal as a preacher made him doubly a light in the darkness of his times. He undertook to assist Asbury in composing the differences in the societies, and agreed to attend and participate in the proceedings of the forthcoming Methodist Conference. It was during this tour also that Asbury had his first meeting with James O'Keefe, who afterwards became his strong antagonist and led the first schism from the Methodist body in America. The impression which the future schismatic made upon the future bishop was most favorable, and for a long time after this meeting there was much confidence between them. Indeed, O'Keefe now stood next to the leader himself. About this time Asbury was joined by Edward Bailey, a faithful local preacher, who became his traveling companion on the journey through North Carolina. In a chaise, they traversed the wide and unmarked circuits, fording deep rivers, winding and cutting their way through trackless forests and over broken and rocky ledges, crossing the Tar, the Neuse, and Haw rivers. They pushed well nigh into the heart of the state. Returning by a more westerly path, they came to the town of Hillsborough, then a place of some importance, and still possessing a real historic interest. From this point, they continued their return in a direct course to the Virginia line, and on the 8th of September crossed the Roanoke River, having spent somewhat more than 2 months in the Carolina circuits. Soon after returning to Virginia, Asbury was deeply saddened by the death of his faithful traveling companion, who expired after a brief warning in the midst of zealous labors. About this time also he took another degree in patriotism, and was led to more fully declare his fealty to the American cause. On receipt of the news that the army of the General Gates had been defeated by Cornwallis, he wrote in his journal, "I have a natural affection for my own countrymen, yet I can hear them called cruel and calmly listen to threatenings of slaughter against them." It was his sense of English justice that made him a loyal American. Although the Virginia Conference had adjourned early in May, it was not until the middle of September that Asbury communicated to Mr. Wesley information of the reconciliation of the divided societies. There are 2 possible reasons for this delay. The first is that Asbury may have found no earlier opportunity for dispatching a letter. Private postal matter meant for England had first to go either to France or the Netherlands, and from thence through the post of another and friendly power. Ships sailed at long and uncertain intervals, but what is more likely to have been the reason was that Asbury desired first to satisfy himself as to the sentiment amongst the people. The contents of the letter which he wrote are not now fully known, but the communication which came from Mr. Wesley by the hand of Dr. Coke in 1784, and the commission which he bore to organize a church and ordain a clergy, were a full answer to the request which it preferred. From this first general tour, Asbury returned to his earthly Eden, Perry Hall, praying as he went a ceaseless prayer for the peace of the people he had seen scattered through the wilderness. In the Old Testament and in Al-Quran, there's this word that in both languages means horizons. And the pray without ceasing verse in the what people call the New Testament is a more general type of prayer. Dhikr, remembrance, would be the or zikr in the Old Testament language, would be that type of prayer. His faith was strong, divinely strong, but he could not then grasp that vision of the future which would have given him rest from every thought of the morrow. But the ways of the Most High, in Ekankar, that would be Jot Naran John, are hidden, that the faith of his chosen may have its needed exercise. At his going out in the early spring, his purse had been by the princely Goth replenished with 3 guineas. This stock had largely expanded on its journey through the South, but the last farthing had gone from his hand only when he was in sight, as it were, of the gables of Perry Hill. Thus, the expenses incurred during nearly twice 1,000 miles of travel were accounted for in the expenditure of somewhat less than $10 in coin and a few dollars of almost worthless continental paper. It is not a matter of surprise that, to a man of such simplicity and frugality, a yearly salary of $65 should seem an abundance. The return of the general assistant to the North was timely. During his half-year of absence in Virginia, trouble had arisen in Maryland and Delaware. The quarterly meetings had come on, and the exchange of preachers had taken place, with no authority present to arbitrate their differences of judgment. Serious friction had resulted. This was the really weak point in the polity of early Methodism, but one with which afterwards remedied in the office of the presiding eldership. Within a year after his new investiture, Asbury saw the magnitude of his task. He must be constructively present in every part of the field. To make this possible, he must cause his face and personality to become familiar to the whole body of the people called Methodists. The task was a large one. His apostleship had developed in a call to increase travel and labors, but the prospect gave him joy, and he shrank from no responsibility. He re-entered Delaware in November, and by the coming of the New Year's Day, all friction had been removed. Even graver difficulties yielded to his wise and gentle tactics. Letters came from Virginia saying, "The jarring string has been broken, and those who were friends at first are friends at last." The vision of the prophets upon Shigionoth was repeated. This is factored into Lovecraft's couple phrases there. No, a couple words, or names, you may say them. The advantage which came of holding 2 conferences in 1779 and 1780 suggested to Asbury a continuance of the plan. 2 sessions would accommodate a greater number of the preachers, and in the advent of a renewal of the sacramental question or the emergence of a new difficulty, one section could be held as a check on the other. The point was not to be overlooked by so wise a leader and so careful a disciplinarian as Asbury. 2 sittings were accordingly planned for 1781, the first to be had at Choptunk in Delaware on April 16th, and the other at Baltimore on April 24th. This last sitting was, in fact, the regularly adjourned session at the Virginia Conference, which had met at Manikintown the previous year. The statistics for the year showed 10,594 members in society and 54 preachers. At the Baltimore session, there was, for the first time in 2 years, an attendance of preachers from the whole field, and a healthy exchange of assistants and helpers between the North and the South. Asbury's remedy for schism, as also his rule of evangelism, was a circulation of the preachers. At this time, a vast new missionary field was being opened up in the mountains of northern Virginia, and to this territory the general assistant rode after the session of the conference. Sitting out about the end of May, he pushed as far westward as Martinsburg, turning northwestward. From that point, he preached in the wild and picturesque mountain valleys along and beyond the south branch of the Potomac. There he longed to be able to speak with tongues, that he might preach the gospel to the people and kindreds who had come to make their homes into those fair new lands. Well, the other, not glossolalia, but able to speak to whatever language you need to speak to communicate. Commissioning men, he sent them forth to press beyond the mountains to the north and west, and become the vanguard of an itinerant army that latter brought the far-reaching valleys of the Ohio and its tributaries under the dominion of Methodism. In those wonder-spelling mountains, he saw the gushing spring and explored the stalactite caves that have since made famous the Appalachian Highlands of Virginia. It was on this journey also that he had his first taste of real pioneering. On the bare floors of squatters' cabins, on the tops of naked chests, and even on the stony floor of mountain paths, he found often his only rest for the night. But naturally he improved in bodily frame, breathing the ozone of those freer altitudes and drinking the uninfected waters filtered from mountain sands. At the end of the summer, with the fragrance of the laurel and the pine on his garments, high in spirits, and with a widened vision of his undisputed sea, he returned for a brief official tour of Maryland and Pennsylvania. Letters from the peninsula and from the lower stations in Virginia awaited him. Those from the peninsula told of peace and continued revival. The priests of the expiring establishment, united with the Methodist exhorters in the call to repentance. Reverend Charles Pettigrew, an Anglican, afterwards elected to the Protestant Episcopal Diocese of Delaware, was in warm sympathy with the revival. Freeborn Garretson, lately released from prison, where he had suffered for the gospel's sake, had fired the workers with new zeal. Not the common people only, but the aristocracy heard the message gladly. Now could Asbury see the meaning of his 2 years of exile in the pent-up Delaware. The seed which he sowed during those months of seeming vanity had already begun to yield their fruit. The letters from Virginia told of a no less advancing work, but there was still a note of discord, a sporadic discontent, on account of the suspended ordinances, that meant another tour through those parts before the conference should be met. Should meet. But, important as was that visit, it must be delayed. Philadelphia and the more northern stations, lately freed from the incubus of garrisoning armies, must be counseled and helped. The war had left in those parts many wastes that must be repaired without delay. Now, for the first time, we've begun to hear of quarterly meeting conferences, and indeed, at this time, it is difficult to determine the line of distinction between the functions of a quarterly and an annual conference. At the lesser, as at the greater, gathering Asbury, organized circuits, appointed preachers, and administrated discipline. Throughout there was no fixed program, but all things took the course of Christian expediency. The outlines of a great ecclesiasticism were, however, slowly coming into view. No complete account of the Methodist movement in America had been written up to this time, and the need for such a narrative was being felt. Asbury undertook to supply the lack. This work must have been a mere pamphlet, and so far as I have been able to discern, no copy of it is in existence. Some of these tractates could go way up in price. I think there's a conspiracy-laden one. I mean, some roots of truth in that one, but there's an expensive one that was distributed, I think, in California in the 60s or something, and it's like there's a handful of them left, and it was such a weird one that it's like a collector's item. It might, I don't think it's worth too much, like a couple $100 or something. So who knows, those old church tractates of your grandparents could be worth something. You find, are your parents that you've inherited or something. Of similar character was a brochure on the cause and cure of church divisions, meant to offset the arguments of the Fluvanna party. Aside from his journal, these appear to be the most serious literary essays he ever set himself to produce. The quarterly conference visitations in the north being completed, he was again at the beginning of winter in Virginia. The point of going out was Bohemia Manor, the gateway through which he passed to that mysterious Southland that lay before him in the autumn of 1772. What miracles had been wrought in those 10 years? When he first saw Bohemia Manor, he was young and inexperienced, and, though of a courageous faith, he was going forth as one not knowing whither he was led. Then the Methodists in America were but a few hundred. Now they were thousands on thousands and multiplying daily. Then he was the distrusted superior of half a dozen fellow workers. Now he was the chosen leader of the 80 men of faith and iron who were ready to go and come as he said, only asking that he follow Christ as they followed him. Well, are you following Jesus according to what the Bible has Jesus say, or what other characters in the Bible say? And, consider well if there's a difference. Again, his path led through that region of the Old Dominion where 6 years before so remarkable a revival had attended the labors of Shadford and Jarratt, there was now a strong and growing Methodist constituency. The war had not affected the prosperity of the region, but it had been the center of the sacramental disturbance, and the general assistant approached it with apprehension. His fears were, however, groundless, for on arriving he found that the spirit of division was dead, or only lingered in fitful and widely separated manifestations. All along Asbury had trusted much to the sympathy and good influence of Jarratt. Both the preachers and the people in Virginia had a great respect for him, and were much influenced by his advice. This Virginia journey brought Asbury again into his home and parish. The fact that the initial sitting of the conference for the year was to be had at Ellis's preaching house in Sussex made it possible for Jarratt to redeem his pledge made to Asbury the year before, to attend and participate. The sitting took place on April 17th, and Mr. Jarratt opened the proceedings with a discourse. The preachers present signed a paper renewing the agreement of the former year concerning the sacraments, and the conference closed with a second discourse by Mr. Jarratt. The power of God was manifested in a most extraordinary manner, wrote Asbury in his journal. The next day, the preachers and people wept, believed, loved, and obeyed. The church priest and the Methodist general assistant then rode away together, but soon to separate, the churchman to visit certain Virginia circuits as an evangelist, and the general assistant to look after distant parts of the field. As he continued his journey northward, he heard the welcome news that the War of the Revolution had ended in victory for the colonies. His Americanism is reflected in the entry made the same day in his journal. Here I heard the good news that Britain had acknowledged the independence for which America has been contending. May it be so. The Baltimore sitting of the conference began on May 20th. Since the minutes of both sittings were consolidated into one record, it is difficult to ascertain at which sitting any particular action began. It is understood, though, that the important items went before each body for ratification. The minutes of the year show these actions to have been taken, originating presumably with the Virginians. Question 18. Shall we erase that question proposed in the Deer Creek Conference respecting the ordinances? Answer. Undoubtedly we must. It can have no place in our minutes. While we stand to our agreement signed in conference, it is therefore disannulled. Question 19. Did the brethren in conference choose Brother Asbury to act according to Mr. Wesley's original appointment and preside over the American Conference and the whole work? Answer, yes. This was the latter state of the unmetered bishop, more secure than the first, and also was the desire of the people to have ordinances at the hands of their own preachers sepulchred, to have a triumphant resurrection in the Christmas Conference. The latter half of 1782 was spent by Asbury in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. His first care was to discharge a long accumulating correspondence and look after certain church properties embarrassed by anti-war debts. Another office was to plan relief for those chapels harassed by exorbitant ground rents. a burdensome entailment of some of our present-day churches in Baltimore and other eastern cities. The new year brought another call to Virginia. His first sermon in the state was at Williamsburg, the colonial capital, where the fiery eloquence of Patrick Henry had stirred the Cavaliers in the first real assistance to the Hanoverian tyrant. But when Asbury saw it glory, it had none. The functions and the functionaries of state had long before removed to Richmond, and the preacher left it with little hope that it would ever become a fruitful part of the spiritual vineyard. Passing through Virginia, he again entered North Carolina, pushing many leagues farther westward than 1780. The borders of Methodism had been extended far beyond the Yadkin, even to the western base of those uplooming mountains that then formed the hinterland of American civilization, Salem, the famous Moravian settlement in the northern Piedmont, and Hillsborough, the latter still suffering from the calamities of war, were visited, as were many other intervening points. The Virginia sitting of the conference recurred at Ellis's preaching house in Sussex County on May 6, 1783. The session was also the one which met 21 days later in Baltimore, was conducted in great peace. The question of African slavery, often referred to by Asbury and more than once brought up before the conference, came up in a more pronounced form than it had hitherto assumed. The recently published peace and the settled nationality of the colonies gave to the subject a new significance. We all agreed in the spirit of African liberty, wrote Asbury in his journal, and a rule was made, which required local as well as traveling preachers to manumit their slaves where the laws of the state permitted it. And also, wasn't Jesus and the Old Testament prophets more towards the idea of a universal priesthood? Where does it say that these sacraments and ordinances are supposed to be passed on in a